There's a lot of actual news in the world, and generative AI is taking over the dialogue, and it's moving at a pace that none of us have ever seen in the technology industry. I think we'd all agree. The number of companies releasing product and the compounding effect of this technology is phenomenal. I think we would all agree. A product came out this week called AutoGPT, and people are losing their mind over it. Basically, what this does is it lets different GPTs talk to each other. And so you can have agents working in the background, and we've talked about this on previous podcasts, but they could be talking to each other essentially, and then completing tasks without much intervention. So if, let's say, you had a sales team and you said to the sales team, hey, look for leads that have these characteristics for our sales software, put them into our database, find out if they're already in the database, alert a salesperson to it, compose a message based on that person's profile on LinkedIn or Twitter or wherever, and then compose an email, send it to them. If they reply, offer them to do a demo, and then put that demo on the calendar of the salesperson, thus eliminating a bunch of jobs. And you could run these, what would essentially be cron jobs in the background forever, and they can interact with other LLMs in real time. Sachs, I just gave but one example here, but when you see this happening, give us your perspective on what this tipping point means.
Let me take a shot at explaining it in a slightly different way.
Sure.
Not that your explanation was wrong, but I just think that maybe explain it in terms of something more tangible.
Sure.
So I had a friend who's a developer who's been playing with AutoGPT. By the way, so you can see it's on GitHub. It's kind of an open source project. It was sort of a hobby project, it looks like, that somebody put up there. It's been out for about 2 weeks. It's already got 45,000 stars on GitHub, which is a huge number.
Explain what GitHub is for the audience. Thank you.
It's just a code repository, and you can create, repos of code for open source projects. That's where all the developers check in their code. So, for open source projects like this, anyone can go see it and play with it.
It's like Pornhub, but for developers.
It would be more like amateur Pornhub because you're contributing your scenes, as it were, your code base. But yes, continue.
But in any event, this thing has a ton of stars. And apparently just last night, I got another 10,000 stars overnight. This thing is like exploding in terms of popularity. But in any event, what you do is you give it an assignment. And what AutoGPT can do that's different is it can string together prompts. So if you go to ChatGPT, you prompt it one at a time. And what the human does is you get your answer, and then you think of your next prompt, and then you kind of go from there, and you end up in a long conversation that gets you to where you want to go. So the question is, what if the AI could basically prompt itself? Then you've got the basis for autonomy. And that's what this project is designed to do. So what you'll do is, what my friend did is he said, okay, you're an event planner AI, and what I would like you to do is plan a trip for me for a wine tasting in Healdsburg this weekend. And I want you to find like the best place I should go, and it's got to be kid friendly. Not everyone's going to drink. We're going to have kids there, and I'd like to be able to have other people there. And so I'd like you to plan this for me. And so what AutoGPT did is it broke that down into a task list. And every time it completed a task, it would add a new task to the bottom of that list. And so the output of this is that it searched a bunch of different wine tasting venues. It found a venue that had a bocce ball and lawn area for kids. It came up with a schedule. It created a budget. It created a checklist for an event planner. It did all these things. And my friend says he's actually going to book the venue this weekend and use it. So we're going beyond the ability just for a human to just prompt the AI. Where now the AI can take on complicated tasks. And again, it can recursively update its task list based on what it learns from its own previous prompt. So what you're seeing now is the basis for a personal digital assistant. This is really where it's all headed, is that you can just tell the AI to do something for you pretty complicated, and it will be able to do it. It will be able to create its own task list and get the job done, and quite complicated jobs. So that's why everyone's losing their shit over this.
Freeberg, your thoughts on automating these tasks and having them run and add tasks to the list? This does seem like a sort of seminal moment in time that this is actually working.
I think we've been seeing seminal moments over the last couple of weeks and months, kind of continuously. Every time we chat about stuff, or every day there's new releases that are paradigm shifting and kind of reveal new applications and perhaps concepts structurally that we didn't really have a good grasp of before some demonstration came across. ChatGPT was kind of the seed of that. And then all of this evolution since has really, I think, changed the landscape for really how we think about our interaction with the digital world and where the digital world can go and how it can interact with the physical world. It's just really profound. One of the interesting aspects that I think I saw with some of the applications of AutoGPT were these almost like autonomous characters in like a game simulation that could interact with each other, or these autonomous characters that would speak back and forth to one another, where each instance has its own kind of predefined role, and then it explores some set of discovery or application or prompt back and forth with the other agent. And that the kind of recursive outcomes with this agent-to-agent interaction model and perhaps multi-agent interaction model, again, reveals an entirely new paradigm for, how things can be done simulation-wise, discovery-wise, engagement-wise, where one agent, each agent can be a different character in a room, and you can almost see how a team might resolve to create a new product collaboratively by telling each of those agents to have a different character background or different set of data or a different set of experiences or different set of personality traits. And the evolution of that multi-agent system outputs, something that's very novel that perhaps any of the agents operating independently were not able to kind of reveal themselves. So again, like another kind of dimension of interaction with these models. And it again, like every week, it's a whole nother layer to the onion. It's super exciting and compelling. And the rate of change and the pace of kind of, new paths being defined here really, I think, makes it difficult to catch up. And particularly, it highlights why it's going to be so difficult, I think, for regulators to come in and try and set a set of standards and a set of rules at this stage, because we don't even know what we have here yet. And it's going to be very hard to kind of put the genie back in the box.
Yeah, and you're also referring, I think, to the Stanford and Google paper that was published this week. They did a research paper where they created essentially The Sims, if you remember that video game, put a bunch of what you might consider NPCs, non-playable characters, the merchant or the whoever in a video game, and they said each of these agents should talk to each other, put them in a simulation. One of them decided to have a birthday party. They decided to invite other people, and then they have memories. And so then over time, they would generate responses like, I can't go to your birthday party, but happy birthday. And then they would follow up with each player, and seemingly emergent behaviors came out of this sort of simulation, which of course now has everybody thinking, well, of course, we as humans, and this is simulation theory, are living in a simulation. We've all just been put into this. Chamath, is what we're experiencing right now how impressive this technology is? Or is it, oh, wow, human cognition maybe we thought was incredibly special, but we can actually simulate a significant portion of what we do as humans, so we're kind of taking the shine off of consciousness?
I'm not sure it's that, but I would make two comments. I think this is a really important week because it starts to show how fast the recursion is with AI. So in other technologies and in other breakthroughs, the recursive iterations took years, right? If you think about how long did we wait from iPhone 1 to iPhone 2, it was a year, right? We'd waited 2 years for the App Store. Everything was measured in years. Maybe things when they were really, really aggressive and really disruptive were measured in months. Except now, these incredibly innovative breakthroughs are being measured in days and weeks. That's incredibly profound. And I think it has some really important implications to like the three big actors in this play, right? So it has, I think, huge implications to these companies. It's not clear to me how you start a company anymore. I don't understand why you would have a 40 or 50 person company to try to get to an MVP. I think you can do that with 3 or 4 people. And that has huge implications then to the second actor in this play, which are the investors and venture capitalists that typically fund this stuff, because all of our capital allocation models were always around writing 10 and 15 and $20 million checks and $100 million checks, then $500 million checks into these businesses that absorbed tons of money. But the reality is, like, you're looking at things like Midjourney and others that can scale to enormous size with very little capital, many of which can now be bootstrapped. So it takes really, really small amounts of money. And so I think that's a huge implication. So for me personally, I am looking at company formation being done in a totally different way. Yep. And our capital allocation model is totally wrong size. Look, Fund 4 for me was $1 billion. Does that make sense?
Nope.
For the next 3 or 4 years? No, the right number may actually be $50 million invested over the next 4 years. I think the VC job is changing.
Sure.
I think company startups are changing. I want to remind you guys of one quick thing as a tangent. I had this meeting with Andre Karpathy. I talked about this on the pod where I challenged him. I said, listen, the real goal should be to go and disrupt existing businesses using these tools, cutting out all the sales and marketing, right? And just delivering something. And I use the example of Stripe, disrupting Stripe by going to market with an equivalent product with 1/10 the number of employees at 1/10 the cost. What's incredible is that this AutoGPT is the answer to that exact problem. Why? Because now, if you are a young industrious entrepreneur, if you look at any bloated organization that's building enterprise class software, you can string together a bunch of agents that will auto-construct everything you need to build a much, much cheaper product that then you can deploy for other agents to consume. So you don't even need a sales team anymore. This is what I mean by this crazy recursion that's possible.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious to see how this actually affects like all of these,
it's a
singular product companies.
Yeah. I mean, it's a continuation, Chamath, of...
And then the last thing I just want to say is related to my tweet. I think this is exactly the moment where we now have to have a real conversation about regulation. And I think it has to happen. Otherwise, it's going to be a shit show.
Let's put a pin in that for a second, but I want to get Sachs's response to some of this. So, Sachs, we saw this before. It used to take $2 or $3 million to commercialize a web-based software product app. And then it went down to $500K, then $250. I don't know if you saw this story, but if you remember the hit game on your iPhone, Flappy Birds, was a phenomenon. Hundreds of millions of people played this game over some period of time. Somebody made it by talking to ChatGPT 4 and Midjourney in an hour. So the perfect example, and listen, it's a game, so it's something silly, but I was talking to 2 developers this weekend, and one of them was an okay developer, and the other one was an actual 10x developer who's built, very significant companies, and they were coding together last week. And because of how fast ChatGPT and other services were writing code for them, he looked over at her and said, you're basically a 10x developer now. My superpower is gone. So where does this lead you to believe company formation is going to go? Is this going to be, massively deflationary and companies like Stripe are going to have 100 competitors in a very short period of time? Or are we just going to go down the long tail of ideas and solve everything with software? How is this going to play out in the startup space, David Sachs?
Well, I think it's true that developers, and especially junior developers, get a lot more leverage on their time. And so it is going to be easier for small teams to get to an MVP, which is something they always should have done anyway with their seed round. You shouldn't have needed, 50 developers to build your V1. It should be, that's the founders, really. So that I think is already happening, and that trend will continue. I think we're still a ways away from startups being able to replace entire teams of people. I think right now we're at the phase of this.
Define a ways. Months, years, decade.
Well, it's in the years, I think, for sure. We don't know how many years. And the reason I say that is it's just very hard to replace, 100% of what any of these particular job functions do. 100% of what a sales rep does, 100% of what a marketing rep does, or even what a coder does. So right now, I think we're still at the phase of this where it's a tool that gives a human leverage. And I think we're still a ways away from the, human being completely out of the loop. I think right now, I see it mostly as a force for good, as opposed to something that's creating a ton of dislocation.
Friedberg, your thoughts?
If we follow the trend line, to make that video game that you shared took probably a few hundred human years, then a few dozen human years, then, with other toolkits coming out, maybe a few human months, and now this person did it in one human day using this tooling. So if you think about the implication for that, I mentioned this probably last year, I really do believe that at some point, the whole concept of publishers and publishing maybe goes away. Where, much like we saw so much of the content on the internet today being user generated, most of the content is made by individuals, posted on YouTube or Twitter. That's most of what we consume nowadays, or Instagram or TikTok in terms of video content. We could see the same in terms of software itself, where you no longer need a software startup or a software company to render or generate a set of tools for a particular user, but that the user may be able to define to their agent, their AI agent, the set of tools that they would individually like to use or to create for them to do something interesting. And so the idea of buying or subscribing to software, or even buying or subscribing to a video game or to a movie or to some other form of content starts to diminish as the leverage goes up with these tools, the accessibility goes up. You no longer need a computer engineering degree or computer science degree to be able to harness them or use them. And individuals may be able to speak in simple and plain English that they would like a book or a movie that looks and feels like the following, or a video game that feels like the following. And so when I open up my iPhone, maybe it's not a screen with dozens of video games, but it's one interface. And the interface says, what do you feel like playing today? And then I can very clearly and succinctly state what I feel like playing, and it can render that game, render the code, render the engine, render the graphics, and everything on the fly for me, and I can use that. And so, I kind of think about this as being a bit of a leveling up, that the idea that all technology, again, starts central and moves to kind of the edge of the network over time, that may be what's going on with computer programming itself now, where the toolkit to actually use computers to generate stuff for us is no longer a toolkit that's harnessed and controlled and utilized by a set of centralized publishers, but it becomes distributed and used at the edge of the network by users like anyone. And then the edge of the network technology can render the software for you. And it really creates a profound change in the entire business landscape of software and the internet. And I think it's, it's really like we're just starting to kind of have our heads unravel around this notion. And we're sort of trying to link it to the old paradigm, which is, startups are going to get cheaper at smaller teams. But it may be that you don't even need startups for a lot of this stuff anymore. You don't even need teams, and you don't even need companies to generate and render software to do stuff for you anymore.
Chamath, when we look at this, it's kind of a pattern of augmentation, as we've been talking about here. We're augmenting human intelligence, then replacing this replication or this automation, I guess might be a nice way to say it. So it's augmentation, then automation, and then perhaps deprecation. Where do you sit on this? It seems like Sachs feels it's going to take years. Friedberg thinks, hey, maybe startups and content are over. Where do you sit on this augmentation, automation, deprecation journey we're on?
I think that humans have judgment, and I think it's going to take decades for agents to replace good judgment. And I think that's where we have some defensible ground. And I'm going to say something controversial. I don't think developers anymore have good judgment. Developers get to the answer or they don't get to the answer. And that's what agents have done, because the 10x engineer had better judgment than the 1x engineer. But by making everybody a 10x engineer, you're taking judgment away. You're taking code paths that are now obvious and making it available to everybody. It's effectively like what you did in chess. An AI created a solver, so everybody understood the most efficient path in every single spot to do the most EV positive thing, the most expected value positive thing. Coding is very similar that way. You can reduce it and view it very, very reductively. So there is no differentiation in code. And so I think Friedberg is right. So for example, let's say you're going to start a company today. Why do you even care what database you use? Why do you even care which cloud you're built on? To Friedberg's point, why do any of these things matter? They don't matter. They were decisions that used to matter when people had a job to do and you paid them for their judgment. Oh, well, we think GCP is better for this specific workload, and we think that this database architecture is better for that specific workload, and we're going to run this on AWS, but that on Azure. And do you think an agent cares? If you tell an agent, find me the cheapest way to execute this thing, and if it ever gets not, cheaper to go someplace else, do that for me as well, and, ETL all the data and put it in the other thing, and I don't really care.
So you're saying it will swap out Stripe for Adyen or
It doesn't.
Node for Amazon Web Services. It's going to be ruthless.
It's going to be ruthless. And I think that the point of and that's the exact perfect word, Jason. AI is ruthless because it's emotionless. It was not taken to a steak dinner. It was not brought to a basketball game. It was not sold into a CEO. It's an agent that looked at a bunch of API endpoints, figured out how to write code to it to get done the job at hand that was tasked to it within a budget, right? The other thing that's important is these agents execute within budgets. So another good example was, and this is a much simpler one, but a guy said, I would like 7 days worth of meals. Here are my constraints from a dietary perspective. Here are also my budgetary constraints. And then what this agent did was figured out how to go and use the Instacart plugin at the time, and then these other things, and execute within the budget. How is that different when you're a person that raises $500,000 and says, I need a full stack solution that does X, Y, and Z for $200,000? It's the exact same problem. So I think it's just a matter of time until we start to cannibalize these extremely expensive, ossified large organizations that have relied on a very complicated go-to-market and sales and marketing motion. I don't think you need it anymore in a world of agents and AutoGPTs. And I think that to me is quite interesting because A, it creates an obvious set of public company shorts. And then B, you actually want to arm the rebels. And arming the rebels, to use the Toby Lutke analogy here, would mean to seed hundreds of one-person teams, hundreds, and just say, go and build this entire stack all over again using a bunch of agents.
Yeah,
and I think recursively, you'll get to that answer in less than a year.